together. Secondly, the other things that are for those of you who have contact with undergraduates who might be considering or be interested in considering philosophy of science as a career, the summer program for undergraduate students run by the center also has a deadline coming up. And so if you want to encourage those students to apply, they're really awesome. That's an awesome summer program that we run. Okay, so now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Eric Hochstein, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Victoria, which is a really pretty place, I think. I've seen pictures. He works in general philosophy of science, philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of language, everything from the neck up.
That's
and so, sorry. I mean, there are people who do the philosophy of sex, which would be in a different location. Anyway, okay, so rather than tell you a lot about him, I think what I want to do is just suggest that we listen to his talk, if that's okay with you. And his talk today is Mechanistic Mayhem. I don't know if he's encouraging us to engage in mayhem, but we'll leave it to Eric.
Thanks so much, Sandy, and thanks everyone for coming out. It is the end of the semester and everyone is burned out and it is cold out there. And so I realize it is no small feat that everyone came out in the cold to come and hear this talk. So thank you to everyone. Appreciate that. Of course, if there's anyone watching on live stream, you didn't come out in the cold and you're lazy, but I still appreciate you. Okay, so I'm gonna jump right into things. So mechanistic theories of explanation are considered one of the dominant theories of scientific explanation in contemporary philosophy, especially when it comes to the life sciences, biology, physiology, neuroscience, medicine. The idea behind mechanistic explanation is pretty straightforward. The idea is that we want to explain a complex phenomenon in science. We often do so by understanding how the phenomenon is produced or instantiated by structures in nature that are organized in particular ways that interact to instantiate the phenomenon. So if you want to understand how, say, circulation works, you want to explain circulation, you need to understand things like arteries and veins and hearts, how they're organized together, how they interact, the heart pumping blood to send the blood throughout the body. That is the extent of my knowledge of how circulation works. But it is clearly my field. Despite being still extremely popular as a theory of explanation, in the past 2 decades, it's come under increasing fire and criticism. And it has actually spawned a number of particular debates that continue to dominate discussion about mechanistic explanation today. What I want to try to do today is I want to try to argue that what's making some of these debates more problematic is that there's a tendency for people to run together issues. Specifically, there's a tendency for people to run together questions about mechanisms as things in the world, representations of mechanisms in terms of models and theories, and mechanistic explanations as answers to why questions that give us an understanding of a phenomenon by making references to it. People aren't clear differentiating these things, and I think it's making these debates more intractable than they ought to. So I want to sort of highlight this. My point is not to argue that once we get clear on this, all the problems go away. They do not. There are lots of empirical and philosophical and metaphysical questions and issues surrounding mechanisms and mechanistic explanation. But I'm worried that the debates are being hijacked by discussions that are largely made worse by these confusions. So hopefully, by straightening them out, we can get our debates onto the right topics. So here's how I'm going to try to make this case. First part of the talk, I want to give a general account on what we mean by mechanistic explanation and what's called the new mechanism group. In section 2, I'm going to highlight 3 dominant debates that have surrounded mechanistic explanation. In section 3, I'm going to highlight why I think these debates are made worse by this conflation between mechanisms, representations of mechanisms, and mechanistic explanation. And lastly, in section 4, I'm going to offer a couple of what I hope are some new insights that can help at least push things in a positive way. All right, so let's start with section 1. Oh no. First problem already. All right. All right. The rise of mechanistic explanation. I was very, very tempted to make a Terminator Rise of the Machines joke, but A, that is not the best Terminator movie. B, that's a terrible joke. And C, this is a talk to the center. Philosophy of science, it's being live streamed. Should be a bit more mature and professional. Then I remembered I'm neither mature nor respectful, so I was in there. So to understand mechanistic explanation more generally, I think it's important to talk to situate it a bit more historically, because the rise of mechanistic explanation in what we call the new mechanist movement was a response to the problems of the previous dominant theory of explanation, the deductive nomological theory of explanation. Now, I don't want to go too far into that debate because that is very, very, very well-trodden territory, especially here at Pitt. But I do think it's important to say something about what the dominant theory of explanation was in the early part of the 20th century and the problems it faced, since that will get our intuitions in the right space for what makes mechanistic explanation really plausible for a lot of people. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the general gist of the deductive nomological view of explanation, or DN account, sometimes called the covering law model, basically goes something like this. So in the first half of the 20th century, using examples from physics as its paradigmatic cases, logical empiricists argued that the best way to explain phenomenon in science is to show us how the phenomenon came about in virtue of antecedent conditions and laws of nature. So the general idea here is to explain the phenomenon, tell me some antecedent conditions in the world, tell me some law-like generalizations, and show me that given those antecedent conditions and laws, we can predict and thus explain why the phenomenon occurred. More technically, they argued that a good explanation in science can be structured in the form of a sound argument in propositional logic, where the conclusion of the argument is the explanandum phenomenon, which is a description of the phenomenon, and the explanans, which explains them, are premises that describe antecedent conditions and law-like generalization. So this picture is from a very famous Hempel and Oppenheim paper, Studies in the Logic of Explanation. The idea being you have a good explanation when you can logically deduce the explanandum from the explanans. Another key factor here is explanation is thought of as a kind of prediction. If I can predict that the phenomenon had to occur, given antecedent conditions and laws, you explain. So here's from the same paper. Here is a nice example that I always found really compelling. So here's what we want to explain. Imagine you're rowing and you put your oar partway in the water. It looks like the part of the oar underwater is bent. So what explains this? So here's Hempel and Oppenheim. To an observer in a rowboat, that part of an oar which is underwater appears to be bent upwards. The phenomenon is explained by means of general laws, namely the law of refraction and the law that water is an optically denser medium than air, and by reference to certain antecedent conditions, especially the facts that the part of the oar is in the water, part in the air, and that the oar is practically a straight piece of wood. Thus, here again, the question, why does the phenomenon happen, is construed as meaning according to what general laws and by virtue of what antecedent conditions does the phenomenon occur. Now, this theory of explanation actually works really well in a lot of cases, especially if we're using physics as our guide. But in the second half of the 20th century, it came under a great deal of criticism since it seemed like there were lots of cases where the DN account wouldn't work very well. Now, I don't want to go over all of them, but I do want to talk about two objections that have been raised in particular, because these are the ones that are going to help motivate the mechanistic view of explanation, which came after. So the first objection is the asymmetry of explanation. The second is going to be the lack of explanatory power. In other words, sometimes when we use a DN model to explain, we're not so much explaining the phenomenon as we are just merely re-describing it. Now, let's start with asymmetry of explanation. Now, as everyone in philosophy of science knows, it is required by law when talking about asymmetry of explanation to talk about the flag pole of the shadow, and it's punishable by death if you don't. So, who am I to block tradition? So this example was originally developed by Bromberger in the 1960s, but everyone and their grandmother uses it whenever they talk about this. Here's how the argument generally goes. Let's suppose it's a sunny day, you have a flagpole, and it's casting a shadow on the ground. Here's what I want an explanation of, a good scientific explanation. I want a scientific explanation for why the shadow cast by the flagpole is 20 meters long. Now, using the DN account, we can tell a story that works really nicely. First, tell me some antecedent conditions. The flagpole is 20 meters high. The angle of elevation of the sun is 45 degrees. Tell me some general law, give me a law like generalization. Light travels in a straight line. Given the position of the sun, the height of the flagpole, and the way light travels, we can predict and thus explain why the shadow is 20 meters. Great, that works really well. There's a nice thing to it. Problems arise, though, when we try to explain a different part of the same system using the same strategy. So let's suppose I'm not trying to explain why the shadow is 20 meters long. I want to explain why the flagpole is 20 meters high. I should be able to run the same story, but it doesn't seem like we've got a good explanation. So if I want to explain why the flagpole is 20 meters high, give me some antecedent conditions. One antecedent condition is it's casting a shadow 20 meters long. Another is the angle of elevation of the sun is 45 degrees. Give me a law like generalization, light travels in a straight line. Knowing the position of the sun, how light moves, and the position of the shadow, I can predict the flagpole is going to be 20 meters high. But that doesn't seem like it's a good explanation for why the flagpole is 20 meters high. Seems like the right explanation is going to be something like that's the specifications the factory had when it made the flagpole. So here, it looks like the explanation goes in one direction. The height of the flagpole and the position of the sun and the movement of light does explain the shadow, but the position of the shadow, the position of the sun, and how light moves does not seem to explain the height of the flagpole. So the explanation goes in one direction, but not the other. This is what we mean when we talk about the asymmetry of it. So what accounts for this? Well, a really compelling and intuitive answer here is that what's going on is we think that the position of the sun and the position of the flagpole are organized in particular ways which are in relation to one another, so that the light coming from the sun causally interacts with the flagpole to cause a shadow that's 20 meters long. That's why the explanation goes that way. But we don't think that the position of the sun, the movement of the light, and the length of the shadow cause the flagpole to be 20 meters long. That doesn't seem to be what's going on there. Therefore, we think that partly what explains the asymmetry of explanation is there's an asymmetry of causal relations here, and that the asymmetry of explanation maps onto the asymmetry of causation. Let's now talk about the second objection. That sometimes when we use a DN model, we're not so much explaining as we are redescribing. So here, let's go with Moliere's very famous joke, where the doctor is brought to the opium den, and someone says, Mary's taking opium, and every time Mary takes opium, she falls asleep. What explains this? And the doctor's like, oh, here's what explains it. Opium has sleep-causing abilities. Done. Or, in this terms, why opium produces sleep? Because there is in it a dormitive power, dormitive function. So look, the general idea here is that you can structure this kind of response using the DN account. Tell me some antecedent condition. Mary takes opium. Tell me a general law like generalization. Taking opium makes you fall asleep. Therefore, we can predict and explain why Mary fell asleep when she took opium. But that's not a very good explanation. We already know that Mary falls asleep when she takes opium. That's what we're trying to explain. Redescribing it in the form of a sound argument structure isn't particularly informative. So what would be a good explanation here? Well, again, it seems like what would be a good explanation is, tell me how Mary's physiology is structured. What is her physiology? How is it put together? What are the physiological processes at work? What is the chemical structure of opium? And how is it causally interacting with her physiology to induce unconsciousness? Then you've got a good explanation. So what's interesting about these cases, they all seem to highlight this fact that in many cases, a good explanation requires telling me how the phenomenon is brought about by showing how it is instantiated by structures, organized in particular ways, and interacting in particular ways to instantiate the phenomenon. So this is the general sort of intuition at work here. If you want to explain pregnancy, tell me something about the ovaries, the uterus, the fallopian tube, the egg and the sperm, how they're organized together so that the egg travels down the fallopian tubes. The sperm how they interact. The sperm fertilizes the egg gets attached to the uterine wall. There is an explanation. So that's the general intuition beyond the mechanistic theory of explanation. Now, this gave rise to what we call the new mechanist. The moniker new in new mechanist is intended to emphasize that the way we think about mechanisms in explanation in the late 20th century and beyond is very different from how we thought about mechanisms prior to the 20th century. So ever since at least Descartes, likely earlier, it's not uncommon for us to explain things by appealing to mechanisms, but mechanisms were always thought of in very, very particular ways. The new mechanists want to argue that when we're talking about biological mechanisms, we're going to deviate from some of the things that we thought were baked into the idea of mechanisms. So I always like the wind-up pocket watch as this example. Old views of mechanisms assumed that the parts of that mechanisms are basically machines, where they have very, very well localized, well delineated parts that are all orchestrated together and causally interact in order to instantiate the system. So machines can be on or off. The new mechanists want to argue that we shouldn't think of mechanisms in biology as machines like this. The parts that biological systems are a lot messier. The parts that make up a biological system are not going to be well localizable and clearly structured in the same sort of way. Machines can be off or on. Mechanisms are not off. Mechanisms are always things doing. Second, the older views of mechanisms always assume that mechanisms were teleological. Mechanisms have a proper function, and they can break down. If the watch is not keeping time, it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. The new mechanists deny that mechanisms in nature need to be teleological. All it requires is whenever there is a complex phenomenon or behavior, it is in virtue of being instantiated by structures causally interacting in particular ways. If they're not, phenomenon's not there. Well, you don't have to have any notion of what they're supposed to do. Lastly, old views of mechanisms were very reductionistic. Once you've told me everything about the springs and the gears and I was going to say pulleys. I don't think there are pulleys in these watches. Once you tell me all of these sorts of structures, you've told me everything there is to know about the watch. There's nothing left over. So you can fully explain everything about this in terms of the parts they got. The new mechanists argue that mechanistic explanation is not reductive in this way. It's partly reductive. A good mechanistic explanation does have to tell you how the system is put together and what its parts and organization are. But they acknowledge that biological mechanisms, when put in different contexts, will do different things. So a full account of the behavior of a mechanism has to take into account its context, especially because a mechanism can be a part of a larger mechanism. And when that happens, it can take part in complex relations like feedback loops, regulatory mechanisms, inhibitory mechanisms, which will change their behavior. So mechanists argue that mechanistic explanation is not reductionistic, it's multi-level. But part of the story does require understanding how the system's. Okay, so that's mechanisms and mechanistic explanation. Let's now go to section 2, the controversy. This is my favorite controversy because despite what everyone says, this is the right way to handle the paper. And I will die on that. My intuitions about mechanisms, those can change, but that a priori, that was that. Okay. So let's talk a bit about, I want to talk about 3 controversies that have tended to, there are more, but I want to talk about 3 given constraints on time that have dominated discussions about mechanistic explanation. The first surrounds the idea of the 3M requirement. This has been proposed by David Kaplan and Carl Craver. And the idea behind it is very intuitive if you're a mechanist. The general idea here is that a good mechanistic explanation has to tell me the underlying structures, organizations, and causes that produce the phenomenon. Therefore, scientific model is more explanatory the more it does this. The more it describes the structures and causes of the phenomenon, the more explanatory that model is. The reason it's called the 3M criteria, this stands for models to mechanisms mapping. So here's how David Kaplan describes it. He says, quote, a model of a target phenomenon explains that phenomenon to the extent that A, the variables in the model correspond to identifiable components, activities, and organizational features of the target mechanism that produces, maintains, and underlies the phenomenon, and B, the perhaps mathematical dependencies posited among these perhaps mathematical variables in the model correspond to causal relations among the components of the target model. This view has come under a great deal of scrutiny. Majvita Chirmuda, for instance, argues against it. So she argues that this view seems to be committed to the idea that the more details about the mechanism you include, more explanatory the model is. She first uses more details to that. I do want to note that that is not quite a fair characterization, and Kepler and Paver have pushed back, I think rightfully so. Their claim is not that any details about the mechanism makes it more explanatory. You need more details about the relevant structures, organization, and causes. But even if you accept that, many people argue it's still the case that there are many models in the life sciences that are explanatory when they don't tell you the structures, organization, and causes. And in fact, they're not made better by including those details. So Chirmuda gives the example of an efficient coding explanation. She says sometimes in neuroscience, we'll give a computational model to explain a particular kind of behavior. And if we ask why, what is the explanation for why this neural circuit or these class of neural circuits are carrying out this computation? She says the right answer, the right explanation is that computation is the most efficient way for the system to solve the problem. That solution will allow the system to solve the problem within the time frame with the least amount of resources. She says, so she's actually trying to make two different points here, but I want to separate them. One point is she's going to argue that, actually, let me get back to that in just a second. Let me flesh this out a bit. So she says the efficient coding explanation is not made better by putting more mechanistic details in to the model. The reason being, lots of different neural circuits with lots of different mechanisms can all carry out the same computation. And the explanation for why they're all carrying out the same computation is because it is the most efficient way to solve the problem. So putting in more mechanistic details of any one of these systems is not going to help you explain why a whole class of systems, in fact, carries out this computation. So here she says adding more mechanistic details does not, in fact, make the model more explanatory, even if you consider them relevant to understanding. Now, Chirmuda is actually making 2 points here, but I want to separate them and deal with them each separately. The first claim is related to the 3M criteria. 3M criteria is wrong. It's not the case that the more details you add about the relevant parts of the mechanism, the more explanatory it is. The second point she's making is that there are different kinds of explanations in life sciences. Sometimes we have mechanistic explanations. Sometimes we have efficient coding explanations. I want to treat those as separate issues so we don't run them together. So for a moment, let's leave that second question aside. We're just focusing on the 3M criteria. So she gives these examples that, again, idealized and abstract models can and do provide good explanations in virtue of being abstract and idealized. The mechanists have responded arguing that these kinds of models might be useful, they might be important, might be informative, but if they're not telling you the relevant features of the mechanism, they're not really useful. So that's one debate. Second debate. Michael Silberstein, very, very recently in a 2021 article, argues that biological systems aren't actually mechanisms in the optics. So leave aside questions about representation and explanation. If we're talking about biological systems, Silberstein argues that biological systems don't meet the criteria to metaphysically be mechanisms, thus they're not explained mechanisms. And the reason he gives this is he says, while mechanists are committed to the idea that they're not reductionist, he says, they really mean they're not reductionist in the theory reduction sense. Theories of whole mechanisms can't be reduced to theories of difference. But he says they are committed to a kind of ontological reductionism, where the whole organism ontologically reduces to the parts, the localized parts organized in particular ways. So he says, the way he puts it is that according to the mechanists, systems in nature are designed in accordance with the principle of decomposition and localization, that the system can be entirely accounted for by a localized parts that are organized in particular ways, and that metaphysically, if you've got all of the parts organized in the right way, you've got all the properties of the system. And then he says, but we know, so he says mechanists have to be committed to this, because if they're not, then they're not really talking about mechanisms. And then he says, biological systems aren't like this. One reason being, he argues there are system level properties that the whole system has that are emergent properties. These system level properties cannot be decomposed and localized, and they cannot be metaphysically accounted for by decomposition and localization. These system level properties come about when the entire system is embedded in different kinds of environments and contexts. So he calls this contextual emergence. Because of this, he says, these aren't mechanisms, mechanistic explanation doesn't apply. Now he says, look, mechanists, if they want, can broaden their definition of what makes something a mechanism to include not requiring decomposition and localization and allowing for emergent contextual properties. He says, but if they do that, they're widening the definition of mechanism so much that everything becomes a mechanism, and so mechanistic explanation becomes trivial or vacuum. So this is what he says. He says, giving up the claim that localization and decomposition are both necessary and sufficient for mechanistic explanation threatens to make the new mechanistic philosophy too broad, non-unique, or downright trivial. The essence of mechanistic explanation, what distinguishes it from mere causal or dynamical explanation, is its compositional or constitutive character. If the new mechanists jettison this feature of mechanistic explanation, if they fully acknowledge the essentially dynamic nature of such explanations and systems, it's not clear what, if anything, is unique about mechanistic explanation. So that's the second debate, whether or not biological systems really are. Third debate is, I want to revisit Shiramuda's point about whether or not efficient coding explanations are different kinds of explanations from mechanistic explanation. In which case, this is the debate between explanatory modisms and explanatory pluralism. In other words, in the life sciences, is it really true that all our explanations, or even our best explanations, are always mechanistic? A number of people have argued that we explain in lots of different ways in the life sciences. I'm, by the way, clearly restricting this talk just to the life sciences for the sake of simplicity. So, for instance, Majvida Chiamuda argues there are efficient coding explanations. Lauren Ross, who I'm going to talk about in just a sec, talks about pathway explanations. Alia gave a great talk a few weeks ago, giving her account of design explanations. And so here we have, the argument is there are different, there's Alia, design explanations. There you go, just like that, throw it in there. So here, the argument is there are different explanatory strategies. So Lauren Ross, for instance, pushes back on the mechanists very hard, where the mechanists want to argue that mechanisms in nature are not machines, and that successful explanations in the history of science, at least life sciences, have worked because they have revealed or described or represented these mechanisms. Lauren Ross pushes back, arguing that this view of mechanistic explanation is just at odds with how neuroscientists in fact use the concept of mechanism and mechanistic explanation. She says if we pay attention to how people talk about mechanistic explanation, they actually do treat mechanisms as though they're machines. So she argues that mechanistic explanation in the science, as it's used in science, works by analogizing the brain as a kind of machine. And then we look for the localized parts, the machine-like parts of the system, how they're organized and how they interact. That is one strategy by which we explain. You say, but sometimes that they're not interested in doing. Sometimes they'll explain via different strategies. She argues that we'll use pathway explanations. When we use a pathway explanation, we're not trying to interpret the system as a machine and figure out what its parts are. We're interpreting the system as a set of pathways or roads and characterizing how information flows through those roads or pathways. In this case, it's a different explanatory strategy, useful for telling us different sorts of things. So here's how I characterize her general idea here. Unlike mechanistic explanation, in which, quote, scientists identify a system and behavior of interest and then drill down to identify the system's parts, their locations, and how they interact to produce the behavior in question. Pathway explanations, quote, track the flow of some entity or signal through a system, end quote, and analogizing the brain as a set of pathways or roads instead of as a machine. With this in mind, there's good reasons why scientists can and just do distinguish mechanistic explanation from pathway explanations. Different types of explanations are used to learn different sorts of things about a given system, and so distinguishing them as working scientists do is relevant to understand explanatory language. So this is the third debate, pluralism versus. Okay. let's now talk about why I think all three of these debates seem more intractable, in part because of some confusions that are going on. In other words, what I'm going to argue is there's a tendency to conflate mechanisms as things in the world with representations or models of mechanisms, with mechanistic explanations as answers to questions that give us an understanding by making reference to mechanisms. We want to be careful not to run these things together, and I worry they're getting run together all the time. So let's revisit these debates. Think of the 3M criteria. So let's, for the sake of argument, grant most of the claims the mechanists want to make. Let's suppose it's true that all explanations in the life sciences are mechanistic, in that the more we know about the mechanism, the better the explanations. Let's also grant, for the sake of argument, that the more we can describe, reveal, and represent the structures, causes, and organization of a mechanism, the better our explanation. Even if you accept that, that is not sufficient to justify the 3M criteria. Why? Because the 3M criteria is a claim about what an individual model does to be defined. The 3M criteria says if you add more details to this model, or relevant details, the model becomes a better explanation. That is a claim about representation. And we have very good reasons to think that that is false for pragmatic and representational reasons. In other words, oftentimes, in order to represent one relevant part of a mechanism, we have to abstract or idealize away other parts of the mechanism. And so the problem with the 3M criteria is it assumes we can represent all of the relevant structures, organizations, and causes of the mechanism in the same model, and that the more details we add about these things, the better the model is. But we often have to make trade-offs when modeling, and that sometimes we can only represent one feature by misrepresenting another. If we try to represent them both accurately, we get nothing out. So even if we accept their general claim that an explanation does tell us more, a good explanation has to tell us more about the mechanism, that may have to be distributed across a bunch of different representations. Some may tell us about the structure, others about the causal interactions, other about the organization, but we can't use them all together. So here, in other words, I think the mistake they're making is they're running together mechanistic explanation with representations of mechanisms. So here, by confusing those two things, I think they're drawing the wrong. That's one way in which I think these debates, this confusion, is making this debate more difficult than it needs to be. Okay, what about the second debate? What makes something an actual mechanism? This is Silverstein. Now, to Silverstein's credit, he is actually very clear that we need to demarcate mechanisms as things in the world from representations of mechanisms and mechanistic exploration. And he says this right up front. And I'm very much in agreement with him when he says stuff like this. He says, the problem is that the network examples too easily conflate concerns about explanation and abstraction on the one hand with claims about organizational features of complex biological systems that tell against localization and decomposition on the other. Obviously, these two concerns are related, but it's also important to disentangle them. And I agree. And he says this very same thing later on, where he says, second, to make clear that the issue here is not primarily about abstraction or idealization in system neuroscience, but whether or not complex biological systems really do embody localization and decomposition as organizational features. Now, despite telling us that he is very aware that there's a distinction between these things and we shouldn't confuse them, he goes on to confuse them all the time. So much so that it's actually really hard to tell what his criticism actually is. So let's highlight how. So the first way he confuses these things is actually very straight. It's actually right here. So he tells us this is not about abstraction and idealization. It's not about explanation. This is whether complex systems really do embody localization and decomposition as organizational features. Localization and decomposition are not organizational features of mechanisms. They're methods by which we try to study and learn about mechanisms. Mechanisms in nature do not localize and decompose themselves. We try to understand a mechanism by decomposing them into parts that we think are localized. So he's already confusing mechanisms with mechanistic explanation. And mechanists themselves argue that decomposition and localization is a heuristic for explanation. Because remember, the new mechanists argue that the parts of biological systems are often not cleanly localized. Some argue that the parts of mechanisms are context dependent. or can be distributed throughout the system. So that's the first worry. But it gets even worse when he tries to characterize his notion of emergence. So remember, he tells us that the mechanists have to be committed to a kind of ontological reduction, wherein all the properties of the system have to be fully accounted for via decomposition and localization. So he says, but he says this is false because there are contextually emergent properties. Here's how he defines contextual emergence. He actually leans on C.V. Broad. He says, for Broad, the global or systemic properties P, this is the system level properties, of a system S are only reducible in the way he thinks mechanists require when the parts in isolation are sufficient to explain the existence of P. That is, there's reducibility when P can be derived or predicted in principle from the parts of S in isolation or when embedded in similar systems. But how are we supposed to make sense of these kinds of claims? No mechanist would claim that that if we're talking about ontic mechanisms in the world, that the parts of the mechanism in isolation of each other are enough to account for a phenomenon. No one would make that claim. In fact, to be a mechanism by definition is to be a set of organized. But maybe that's not what he means. Maybe he means when the parts together isolated from any context or environment. But again, if we're talking about ontic mechanisms in the world, there are no mechanisms isolated from a context or an environment. They're always in a context or an environment. Likewise, no mechanist ever thought that we could explain the behavior of a mechanism by just looking at its parts. That was the whole idea of mechanisms being multi-level. When they're part of a larger system or in a context, it changes their behavior. So this is already very odd. Now, I think we can try to make sense of what he's saying when we realize that, of course, we can represent the parts of a mechanism abstracted away from an environment. And when we do that, there's an open question about whether or not this type of model or representation is sufficient to allow us to, in his words, explain, derive, or predict the system level properties. That's certainly an open question. I suspect he's right that we can't. But if that's what he means, then he is utterly confused when he says, the issue here is not primarily about abstraction or idealization in system neuroscience, but whether or not complex systems really do embody localization and decomposition. Since it seems like his account is entirely based on whether or not when we abstractly describe the mechanism, parts of the mechanism abstracted away from an environment, is that enough to explain or predict or derive? In which case, it seems like his notion of emergence or reduction is absolutely dependent on notions of explanation, on notions of prediction, on notions of idealization and abstraction. And so with this in mind, it sounds like he is just constantly running together mechanisms with representations of mechanisms with mechanistic explanation. So much so that it's hard for me to figure out exactly what his criticism ends up being. So this now brings me to the third debate. Pluralism. My last one was about chocolate bars in a vending machine, so I thought I had to give some vegetables. So we have different types of explanations. Are there different types of explanations? Efficient coding explanations, topological explanations, Alia's great kind of design explanations, pathway explanations, and mechanistic explanations. Or all these are all of these just species of mechanistic explanation? If this is the battle between Ross and Craver. Now, someone like Carl Craver is going to argue that we have different ways of modeling the world, but what gives any of them any explanatory power is that they're revealing something about the underlying structures, organizations, and causes. They're fitting things in the causal structure of the world. While Lauren Ross argues that this is just at odds with how neuroscientists use the term mechanistic explanation. Mechanists say that mechanisms aren't machines. Ross argues we engage in mechanistic explanation. The machine analogy is central. So what's going on in this conflict? I think that the big problem here is that the claims they're making are not actually in tension, at least not a priori. The problem is they're just thinking about mechanistic explanation in different ways. And the way I think we could show this is, I think it is entirely possible to accept everything Craver wants to say and everything Lauren Ross wants to say without any contradiction. Here's how. Let's suppose Craver is right that mechanisms as things in the world are not machines, and that historically, regardless of how scientists have tended to refer to explanations, explanatory accounts have always in some way involved revealing something about structures and causes. Now, let's also suppose that Loren Ross is true, that we have good reasons to demarcate explanatory strategies. Some are mechanistic explanations, which are a particular strategy for learning about the world. Others are pathways. That can also be entirely true. In other words, what I suspect is that Craver is interested in the question, what are mechanisms ontologically and metaphysically? And what gives any kind of model explanatory power in any degree? I think Loren Ross is just not interested in that particular question. Her question is, with scientific practice more generally, when scientists claim to be doing mechanistic explanation, here's what they're doing. They're adopting a particular kind of strategy, rooted in a particular analogy, and that strategy is different from another kind. And that is important to demarcate. Calling everything a mechanistic explanation is not particularly helpful. And so, I'm not saying we should accept both views. We could have very good reasons to reject the Craverian story or Loren Ross's story. My point is, the claims they're making are not inherently contradictory views about mechanistic explanation. I think each of them are just focusing on different relations between mechanisms, representations of mechanisms, and mechanistic explanation. But because they call them both mechanistic explanation, it's leading to the assumption that there's direct conflict here, and I don't think there necessarily is. So this is how I think these confusions are permeating these debates. I don't think getting clear on these confusions solves the debates. There are still important questions about what mechanisms are, what our explanatory practices are, and we have to deal with those. But I'm worried that these kinds of confusions are making things worse. That now they're creating debates that are not really what ought to be at issue. So this brings me to my last part of the talk. Oh, is that the right button? No, wrong direction. Looking forward. So here, I want to look forward to offer some of my own sort of potential contributions. So here's a picture of me and our dog Luna looking forward, by which I mean the TV, but pretend there's looking at the future. So how do I want to add to this? So with these debates in mind, I want to offer a couple of what I hope are insights that might help push these debates onto firmer territory so that we can fight over what I think are the important issues. So let's return to the 3M criteria. I think Kaplan and Craver are being driven by an intuition that is actually a really important and insightful intuition, but I think they draw the wrong lesson. In other words, I think Craver and Kaplan are confusing two different points. The first is that the more we know about the underlying mechanisms that constitute and realize a phenomenon, the better our ability to explain it. And two, the more a single model or theory has variables that map to or describe the parts and operations of a mechanism, the more explanatory that model becomes. They say this, and I think this is wrong. And I think this is wrong for all kinds of representational purposes, as I've argued. But I think there's a way of interpreting one that is really important here that is often overlooked. And I want to spell out exactly what I mean by this. So let's suppose we grant what Loren Ross and Mishvita Chiramuda and many others have argued, which is that an idealized model could be by itself a good explanation, good answer to a why question, even though it does not describe the underlying structures and costs of the system. I'm happy to grant that. I do think, however, there's a difference between whether or not the model makes references to the underlying implementational details and whether the scientific community has access to that information that they can appeal to when needed. Those two things are not the same. And I think the second point is important. The more the scientific community has information regarding the underlying mechanisms of phenomenon, and this information is going to be distributed across scientific domains and models and theories, the more the idealized model becomes a good explanation. I'm going to try and sell you on this, so bear with me. Let's return to Chiramuda's example of an efficient coding explanation. She argues that the right explanation for why the system carried out this computation is that is the most efficient way for the system to solve this problem. Is the most is the one that minimizes resource cost in the timeline. That explanation does not make reference to mechanistic details, and putting more of those details into the model does not help. That's true. But the more we know about how the neural circuits are implemented, the more it tells us whether or not the efficient coding explanation will in fact work, under what conditions and why. And that is important. The reason for this is that according to computation theory, the way a system is physically put together affects whether or not the same computation will or won't be resource intensive for that system. So this is a point that Chris Elias-Smith has made. He argues that, quote, Kolmogorov has shown how important the implementation of a computational system is to its computational character. He has proven that two implementations of a given functional description cannot be usefully considered equivalent unless they are almost identical. This is because an algorithm running on one implementation can only be run by another implementation with the addition of an emulator program of some sort. Running this emulator adds computational complexity, making the second implementation significantly different from the first. So the structure of a computer may not affect what class of functions is computable for that computer. However, its structure will significantly affect computational complexity, since an increase in computational complexity necessitates an increase in the time and power needed to perform a computation. The class of actual computable functions within a given period of time and with a fixed amount of computational resources will vary for different physical computers. It is in this way that equivalent computers are significantly not equal. In other words, we cannot determine if this computation is the most efficient way for a circuit to solve a problem unless we know the physical structure of the circuit. Because the same computation will be really, really resource intensive running on one implementation than it will on another. So notice, I'm not saying that the computational model that we used to explain has to describe the implementation of the circuit. But I'm saying whether we know the implementations of the circuit really does affect when, how, and why we think it's appropriate to use an efficient coding explanation for which neurons and under which conditions. The more we know about the implementation, the more it does, in fact, give us a better explanation. Let me give you a couple of other examples. I think the same thing is going to apply to Lauren Ross's notion of pathway explanations. We don't need to talk about the implementation of pathways to give a good pathway explanation. But if we have no idea how pathways are implemented or how they differ in different organisms, we'll have no idea when it's appropriate to use the right kind of pathway explanation, when it breaks down, under what conditions it's appropriate for. Here, whether or not we know how they're implemented as a scientific community really is relevant to our ability to explain, even though our appeal to a pathway explanation doesn't have to reference that information. Doesn't have to reference it, but whether that information is available for use when using it is relevant. Another example, Silberstein says this. He says, it seems clear that global topological features of network models help explain, and are in turn explained by, global organizational features. So this is his, it's not mechanisms, they're global organizational features of complex biological systems, such as robustness, plasticity, autonomy, and universality. And these are things that explain behavior. The problem is whether or not plasticity is a sufficient organizing principle to tell us about the behavior of the system depends on the kind of system it is. Brains are a lot more plastic than hunks of iron, for instance. And the kind of plasticity we see in the brain depends on the kinds of mechanisms that make it up, like long-term potentiation. To highlight this fact, consider a long-standing debate in philosophy of cognitive science about whether the mechanisms of the brain are massively modular or massively interconnected. A very popular view of massive modularity is the idea that the mechanisms that make up the brain are actually genetically encoded. And so we're all born with the same mechanisms, in which case, while the brain can rewire, only in a limited way, if that story turns out to be true. If we take a more connectionist story, on the other hand, the brain can rewire much more substantially. So whether or not plasticity is an organizing principle we can use to explain behavior depends on whether or not the brain is modular or more connectionist. How do we know this? We need to study the underlying structure and implementation of the system. So the more we know about the mechanisms that implement neuroplasticity, the more we can tell when something like plasticity will be a sufficient organizing principle for behavior and when it won't. So again, I'm not saying the model has to refer to it, but I'm saying whether the more we know about it, the better the explanation can be. So that's the first insight that I wanted to bring to the table. The second is this idea that Silberstein makes, which is that if we widen the definition of a mechanism, then everything's a mechanism, and thus mechanistic explanation becomes trivial or vacuous. I think this, not surprisingly, given what I've said before about like Silberstein, I think this claim is confused. I think it's confused for a number of reasons. Let's suppose there are two different ways of describing a mechanism. One is a very liberal definition of a mechanism, in which case we allow that there can be emergent properties, parts don't have to be cleanly localizable. Now we widen the scope of mechanism so much that it describes everything. Or we can adopt a more conservative definition of a mechanism. Silberstein's, where only things that are strictly decompositional and localizable, that don't have emergent properties, only those things. Is it true that if we adopt the more liberal definition, it makes mechanistic explanation vacuous or trivial? I don't think we have any a priori reason to think this. Why? Because I think that confuses mechanisms with mechanistic explanation. And in fact, it's actually really bizarre to me that Silberstein is the one to make this argument. Because he, very famously, along with Tony Camaro, have argued that the best explanation for the brain is not mechanistic or computational, but dynamical. But of course, every system in nature is a dynamical system. Therefore, everything can be described using dynamical systems theory. Does that therefore make dynamical systems theory vacuous and trivial and non-explanatory? I don't think so, and I really don't think Silberstein does. Likewise, we can use probability theory to create a statistical model of literally anything. Does that mean statistics and statistical models are vacuous, trivial, and unexplanatory in science? I don't think so. I think if we adopt a more liberal definition of a mechanism, the relevant question isn't if something is a mechanism or statistical or dynamical. It is what is the correct or pragmatically useful or appropriate description, either mechanistic or statistical or dynamical, of this system given these constraints in these contexts. That is not a trivial point, and that's going to require a lot of work to figure out. And so I don't think that if we choose a liberal definition, I don't think that in any way invalidates things, because I think here again he's running together mechanisms with mechanistic explanation representations. But what if we choose a more conservative definition of mechanism, in which case we say biological systems aren't really ontic mechanisms under the strict sense? I would say, okay, we can do that, but you can't do that at the cost of learning the lessons that we were supposed to learn from mechanistic explanation to begin with. Meaning, if someone comes along and says, the body is not strictly a mechanism, I say, okay, but it still seems to me that if you want to understand pregnancy, you need to understand the structures like the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the egg, the sperm. You need to understand how they're organized. You need to understand how they interact for the sperm to fertilize the egg and for it to attach to the uterine wall. You don't have to call that a mechanism if you don't want, but it still seems that the whole point of the lesson is that learning more about that seems required for the explanation, right? He says if we're too broad, mechanistic explanation is no different than causal explanation. But again, I think that's a glib response. If I say, why does Mary fall asleep when she takes opium? Because opium caused her to. That's causal, but it seems like a good explanation. It's got to tell me about her physiology and how it's interacting. So I think it doesn't really matter if you choose a more liberal or more constrained definition of what a mechanism is. That is not the substantive claims that are really interesting. That's what really matters. I think the biggest issue here is that people are just completely inconsistent in what they take the criteria of an ontic mechanism to be. And that is a problem. So I think that confusion is a bigger issue than if we happen to choose a more liberal or more conservative. Okay, so I'm going to shut up now because I don't want to put everyone to sleep because I have to do that to myself. Thank you, everyone.
We'll take a 5-minute break, get some coffee.